I would like to tell you a story. It is a monster story. It is a conspiracy story. It is a story that, as of yet, has no end. Once upon a time, in a great land, there was a demon. And this demon would possess people and turn them to its own devices. But this demon was no fool. It wasn't the sort of possession where the person would run about like a lunatic and murder others, or behave particularly out of the norm. No, this demon was smart. It was crafty. It knew how to manipulate others. This demon would possess people, and in exchange, it would offer them knowledge of the world outside of them. It would offer them brief moments of happiness, and it would give them happiness whenever they helped infect others, helped possess others with its demonic nature. And it soon came to dominate the entire land. Nobody knows where this demon came from, or who was the first victim that it infected. For the earliest writings in this land show that all had been infected by the demon. And this demon, like all, was a parasite. Although it might offer a bit of knowledge, or it might offer a bit of pleasure, ultimately it would harm all of those that it infected. So you might ask, if this demon was so bad, if it was such a parasite on these people, how did it get there? Well, there's a fairly straightforward answer. In addition to making these people seem happy and peaceful and satisfied with their life, this demon would also make them violent, incredibly violent, when it suited the demon's purposes. And so any group that wasn't possessed and resisted possession was quickly destroyed by the demon. For centuries, millennia, this demon infected all those that it cared about. It had its strongest supporters, of course, the priests. The priests would shout the truth that the demon gave them out from the rooftops. But the priests, though charismatic and popular, had no worldly power. And so this is where the kings and potents and dukes and lords came in. The demon convinced these people to follow it, because if they followed it and supported it, all of the peasants that they dominated would support it. And remember, of course, in those times, the peasants had no resistance to the demon. They were ignorant, illiterate. They trusted the priests to educate them, and the priests told them to obey the kings. And because the kings had the peasants to follow them in the war, the kings obeyed the priests. And so for most of the history of this land, you saw incessant warfare. Duke fighting baron, king fighting king. Those that taxed the poor, ignorant peasant folk were constantly seeking more wealth and power on the backs of their peasants. But these peasants, with the demon infesting them, would gladly go to war painted in their lord's colors and slaughter other peasants just like themselves. And all of it was tribute to the demon. But then something happened. You see, the demon, though wise and crafty and genius at manipulation, was not truly clever. It didn't have the cleverness that you find in a man. It only had the sort of vile cunning that you find in a demon. It could wax eloquent poetry, if need be, to infect one, but it would not truly understand the poetry itself. It was a demon, and demons don't know beauty or truth. And so under the demon's very nose, technology began to develop. In fact, the ironic thing is some of the first progenitors of these technocrats, these scientists, were his very own priests. By keeping them away from women and locking them up for hours on end, they found what he thought was a harmless diversion in the investigation of nature. You see, the kings had relied upon an ignorant peasantry to wage their ceaseless wars, to engage in their constant gamble for wealth and power. Without an ignorant peasantry, they couldn't have done it. And this peasantry eventually developed the printing press. They eventually developed free time, farming implements to free them from the earth, irrigation systems to create more crops than any one man could eat, leading to specialties and the growth of cities. And the next thing you knew, the peasants were educated. And when the peasants became educated, they began to see what was going on. How the kings and the dukes and the lords were manipulating them into petty wars. And how that these figures that the priests had told them had been granted power by the demon. And the demon that loves them, of course. They realized that these potentates did not have their best interests in mind. And so a revolution was formed. But the demon, as ever, was clever and crafty in that vile way that only demons can be. And so what the demon did was take over the revolution. The demon discovered that some of the poetry it had written in the past through its priests, some of the promises it had made, some of the statements about the nature of this species that it infected, could be manipulated, reinterpreted to support this revolutionary doctrine. And so, the priests switched sides to the revolution. And the revolution succeeded, and once again, the demon was in power. Only now, the demon took a new name. Now the demon called itself nationalism. It was the popular idea that these separate cities, these diverse people, had some sort of unique character unifying them. It was an uneasy truce between this newly educated peasant class, the priest class, and the kings and potentates. And they were all given a place to sit in the tennis court of politics. Only some noticed what was going on. That era of nationalism, of the same wars but waged under different premises, and the same church but speaking a different truth, and this newly supposedly empowered peasantry, led to two great thinkers. One became a great critic of the ruling class. He looked around the world and saw all the technological development that was occurring, and yet still saw a disparate amount of poverty amongst the working classes. And so he criticized the elites, the rulers. He attacked them as being disingenuous, that they were the ones exploiting the labor. The other great thinker attacked the church. He shouted, "The church claims it has truth. It claims it has the happiness that we can find in our souls. And yet can't we as our own rational beings, discover our own happiness, our own truths. Of course, both these speakers were ignored because they were speaking to a population infected by the demon. But the problem with this new state of affairs is that previously he had two powerful groups colluding with him. He had the priests and the kings colluding with him to keep the peasantry ignorant because, again, his survival is based upon the misery and suffering of others. He needed wars to survive. And with an ignorant peasantry, they don't notice the misery they're going through in war. They believe it's a glorious, noble thing to pursue. But see, in this modern era, when he's now wearing three hats, and he is standing for the peasantry and their nationalism, this leads to an unfortunate situation. Previously, the wars had been simple gambles for power. Each king would try and take whatever he could get away with, and he'd be happy to run away and retreat if he had to. Only now, kings didn't have that luxury. The dukes and barons and potentates, they had nationalism to answer to. It wasn't quite so easy anymore to turn tail and run away from a battle that you couldn't win and claim that the enemy was against the demon to your peasantry. Now the kings and potentates were stuck doing what their peasantry demanded. And so eventually, over a matter of decades, an alliance system built up, a series of tensions built up between these kings and potentates, with the masses of nationalism pressing down on them, and it exploded into an unwinnable war. This war would be remembered as the war governed by technology, where the technology waged it against itself, while warm bodies simply got in the way. It was the era of the death of cavalry, of the trenches, of the howitzer. And for years, these two alliances battled each other to no effect. Any king from one of the previous eras would have seen the futility in this war, but the driving force of nationalism couldn't. Until finally, the kings were broken. The demon abandoned the kings. The demon blamed the kings for this, and they resigned in disgrace and handed over the reins of power to the people. And so this land, which once upon a time had been a diverse set of city-states, congealed into three great empires. The demon had had time to consider those critics that arose after the Great Revolution, to consider their words and consider how he could transmute them into something that would serve him. The first great society that rose was that which followed the critic of the kings. And so in this society, there were no more kings. There were no more authority figures. There was nobody in control. There was just a priesthood that spoke the demon's truth. And so these priests became kings without what little amount of accountability the kings had ever had. The second society which arose followed that great critic of the church, that which said a man can empower himself. And so with only the institution of kinghood left, The new pseudo-king said, you can empower yourself and become a great man by obeying the state without question. And the third, too ideologically divided to pick one of these two thinkers, picked both of them and picked neither, and wound up with nothing but nationalism. And it told its people that you decide the future of this nation, while a system of bureaucrats ran the country. For a short while there was peace. But as always happens, when different power structures infatuated with the demon encounter each other, there was war. The first to fall was that which rejected religion. It fell under an alliance of the other two. It was the country which treated the state itself as the religion. Then, through a very long and cold war between the following two, the one which has rejected kings and raised priests up to the level of kings, it proved to be more incompetent at self-governing than the bureaucracy which ran the nationalist civilization. And so eventually the nationalist civilization won. Had no more enemies. And so the demon next turned its eyes on embracing those who would write down the stories of the demon. The historians, the educators. These were its new priests. And so these people celebrated the victory of good over evil with that one truly evil empire and that one not quite as evil but still not as good as us empire. And free thought, of course, was still illegal. That's as far as the stories got so far. Now, obviously, what I'm talking about is the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the First World War, and the Second World War. The demon itself has been called many names throughout history. You see it mutating and adapting with each new era. The church, not the religion, not the Bible, which is a bunch of weird contradictory poetry, but the church itself and the kings originally ruled. And then with the French Revolution, suddenly we discover that the Bible proves that we should all have human rights. The advent of nationalism comes from this because we never had a true republic form. We had Napoleon. So then we have nationalism, the inevitable tightening of alliances during the Westphalia era, which eventually devolves into World War I, a completely pointless and brutal conflict where millions died to accomplish absolutely nothing. And then the interwar period. We have Germany embracing the exact opposite of what Nietzsche said. Nietzsche was about empowering yourself as an individual and finding truth, not about obeying the state without question, and yet that's what fascism became. We have communism. Communism, they embrace Karl Marx, who talks about destroying the capitalist class. And yet, communism is all about state capitalism. And then you have the United States, where you just get the pure nationalism, where they pretend that, you actually run the country when you vote, even though you most obviously don't. These are all branches of the same universalist ethos. In the modern era, what it's come to mean is that people have the right to run a country to steal money from themselves. It's just as insane as any religion has ever been. But it's fascinating. What's really fascinating is how these three societies that were founded upon the same basic moral principle regard each other as completely evil. There's the two thinkers I mentioned, of course, Marx and Nietzsche. There is a third great thinker from the 19th century that I didn't mention, who I'll mention now. As, of course, was Darwin. And Darwin's theory of evolution is extremely radical. It essentially disproves religion. Any religion short of deism is completely undermined by evolution. It undermines the state. The state has always been a religious claim to power. The Leviathan, that we need the Leviathan to rule us, is again a religious claim that we can't rule ourselves. Darwin's was the most radical work of that century. And what became of it? Social Darwinism. And this is something all three empires embraced. In fact, it was Californian social Darwinists back in 1933. They were sterilizing 5,000 people a month in California, and they actually organized to start writing the German government pamphlets about how great social Darwinism was, about how great eugenics was, which ultimately led to the Holocaust. The point is that victors write the history. And, supposedly the good guys won World War II, right? Now granted, I'm certainly not going to stick up for Nazi Germany or Communist Russia. The Holocaust, 9 million Jews, between 2 and 8 million Romani, homosexuals, retards, etc., put to death. But remember, they got the idea from California. And also, let's put it in context, there were less than 500 people that knew about the Holocaust. It was a conspiracy within the Nazi government. Go read the Nuremberg trials. It's right in there. Then you have of course, the Soviets. Between 7 and 11 million starved to death in Ukraine. Yeah, it's monstrous. But we are hardly pure ourselves. And see, that's the interesting thing, is that everybody knows about the Holocaust, not many people know about the Ukraine. That's because we found the Nazis more offensive than we found the Soviets. Soviets were an enemy, but they were one we respected. In fact, our economics textbooks from 1988 were talking about how great the Soviet economy was 1 year before it fell. Victors write the history. They say this to every dumbass high school student, and yet somehow the high school student goes on to university and assumes that the history department is full of free thinkers. No, the historians are the modern church. The modern universalist, mind control, censorship, lie about the past church. I should tell you how I got to thinking about all this. So here's the thing. I was watching one of Fringe Element's videos about, he was criticizing some retard that wants to pay teachers more and whatever. But I got to thinking about the free market education. Because right now, in this land controlled by the demon, education is far more important than the church for indoctrination. You know, this is atheist cult. Atheist cult is so proud of their high schools and universities and wants to pay teachers more. They're like, oh, the priests are indoctrinating people. The priests are harmless. It's the educators we have to worry about. Now, in a free market education, would you expect there would be such a focus on history and literature? See, if I were sending my kids in a free market to get an education, I'd want them to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and that'd be about it. I'd want to make sure they were ready to go get a real education. I wouldn't want some idiot teacher teaching them history any more than I'd want them to be educating my kids on culture. For all I know, the Twilight books will be considered literature in 20 years. I don't want my kids learning that. I want them reading Lord of the Rings. I want them reading some Robert Heinlein. Now, I posted something on my blog recently, tearing into just how fake history is, how artificial and dishonest and politically motivated it is. And Giovanni, over at Six Heretics Way, another blog, linked down below, posted the following, which I'm only going to read part of because it was a really long comment. So when he was doing a history major, and he actually finished his, quote, "It was still more a feeder program for the academics and law students. Focus on perfect citations and writing in perfect, unbiased academic style came before substance. I loved the subject material, but chafed at the confines set by the community. You see, you can't say anything big or meaningful unless you have incredibly solid sources and senior standing to back it up. And the slant on history was, of course, far to the left, which hugely limited the already small amount of exploration that would be tolerated. People who do history professionally are supposed to specialize, and once they do so, they spend most of their time writing about points that have already been made by someone else in their field. Or they'll desperately try to be original and build a whole career on lesbian African-American Jewish women during the Civil Rights Movement, or some other irrelevant nonsense. ... Academic historians have long been losing relevance. They've distanced themselves from the really important task, turning past events into a meaningful narrative and interpreting it. What exactly happened, and how sure can we be about it, is hopelessly petty next to why did it happen, and what does it tell us? What are the patterns? Thucydides and Gibbon would quickly lose patience with a modern history program. They think far too analytically and have far too many real opinions and ideas." End quote. History is part of culture. And culture is something that we don't need to be force-fed by academe. Do you need to be force-fed jazz to go find out about jazz? You know, maybe, arguably, in the current mass media-dominated nightmare that is radio. But the fact of the matter is that I know you have discovered a lot of great music out there just through exploration and recommendation by your friends. History, if it interests you, is just as fascinating. And if we didn't have this monopoly on history by the education system, then we'd have much higher quality, much more relevant history out there, supported by the free market as entertainment, but we'd also be a hell of a lot more educated, and more people would know about those people starving in the Ukraine. Maybe as many know about the ones that died in the Holocaust. And maybe there'd be some acknowledgement that social Darwinism was a movement that started in the United States. We don't need people teaching history in schools. People are plenty interested in learning their histories all on their own. So, when they say that those who are the victors write the history, remember that. Ernie out, folks. Your friendly neighborhood historian.